Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much, Jen, and the Worcester Education Collaborative for hosting this event with us this morning. It's great to have this conversation here in Worcester, where we began really all of our Gateway Cities education conversations. Some of you will remember way back in, I don't know when it was, 2011 or 2012, when Governor Patrick joined us here at the Beechwood for the very first conversation about the unique needs of Gateway City school systems. And from that conversation, we gathered up a whole group of Gateway City educators to spend a year in 2013 coming up with this Gateway Cities education vision. The whole premise of the vision that we built together over that year of planning was that Gateway Cities had these exceptional educational assets that could create great learning environments. A lot of the conversation had sort of been, Gateway Cities have all these great strengths, but for our schools, we would be amazing places for people to live and work. And as we thought deeper about the strengths and challenges of our Gateway Cities, it became really apparent to everybody that why do we see the glass as half empty when it comes to the public school systems? The public school systems actually have considerable strength that many public school systems would love to have. When you think about places like Edward Street and the early education partners that the Worcester Public Schools have, that doesn't exist anywhere. And working families today, more than ever, need to be able to put their young ones in a place where they know they're going to get a great early start. When you think about the cultural institutions that partner with the public schools throughout the city, most communities in our Commonwealth aren't fortunate enough to have those resources. The same is true with the public higher education partners the city has, and we know how important early access and exposure to higher education is for the success of students beyond high school. When you look at the vocational school and the employer partners, the ability to expose kids early to career, again, our urban centers are uniquely positioned. And then, of course, the rich cultural and linguistic diversity of all our gateway cities looks a lot more like the world today than a lot of the exposures that other young people in our Commonwealth have. So when you put all these things together, there's no question that we can build really strong learning environments in our gateway cities, leveraging these educational assets. So the vision we put together was sort of a policy program for how we take advantage of those unique strengths, and we called it the Gateway Cities Vision for Dynamic Community-Wide Learning Systems, that big word mouthful of a title. Each part of it really had particular meaning. Dynamic because we thought learning systems had to be nimble in a world that was changing really quickly. Community-wide because we know a lot of learning happens beyond the school walls, and we really need strategic cross-sector efforts in order to get kids all the support and experiences they're going to need to be successful as we move them from cradle toward career. So that was kind of the concept. A lot of this vision was just about the language to explain what it was we aspire to achieve together. But we got really specific in four kind of pillars of policy priority. The first was early education, again, getting more kids exposure to those great early learning systems that Gateway City leaders are working hard to build. Social emotional growth. There was a lot of reasons why this was particularly front and center for Gateway City educators. Unfortunately, part of it had to do with the real unmet mental health needs of families and communities, and schools being supportive places to address traumas that many children in poverty experience. But also recognizing that social emotional competencies are critical to success in the world today, that people need to be able to work together well and communicate well, and school is a place where we can build those skills as well as the academic skills. The college and career pathways, again, if we have all these great opportunities in our gateway cities to expose children early to career opportunities and to this post-secondary options that are going to get them where they want to go, our schools ought to excel at connecting students to those resources. And then lastly, newcomers. I think everybody in our gateway city communities recognizes that the term gateway cities implies largely that these are places where people come from all over the world to experience opportunity. And our school systems are often the first place that they find connection to the community, and schools should be particularly good at the difficult work of engaging parents from all sorts of different cultures and connecting and integrating them into our community. So that was the Gateway City's vision for dynamic community-wide learning systems that many of you, as I look around the world, look around the room, helped us put together. We spent time in little groups talking about particular pieces of this. And we've spent time over the last few years trying to move some of this forward. Many of these things on the list, have become increasingly part of our conversation. I think Gateway City leaders were ahead of the curve on things like social emotional learning, which so much time is spent today addressing. But we haven't seen the kind of resources that Gateway City leaders feel are needed in order to drive some of this work forward. And we're still waiting for that and working together on that and thinking about how resources can be invested in these things as more dollars become available. But in the meantime, as we developed this, there was much conversation about what does an accountability framework look like that supports this kind of learning and this kind of work in our public schools. And an opportunity has come now to really engage in that conversation together as Gateway City leaders. And so over the last 6 months, we put together a learning community. The work actually began, again, here in Worcester. Last March at Clark, we held a forum with Senator Warren and others to talk about this new bill that Congress signed this time last year and say, what is the opportunity in this legislation for small to mid-sized inclusive urban districts that have really been the focal point of all our accountability work? Remember, the Federal Education Accountability Act is about protecting disadvantaged students and ensuring that federal resources that go to public schools for low-income students benefit them and advance their learning. So we had this big dialogue over the last 6 months about accountability, how it plays out in gateway cities, how it can be more effective. And obviously there was tons of different points of view. We learned quickly how complex and challenging these issues are, and really how urgently needed a community dialogue is about all these issues, because this stuff is important, and I think the more deeper we can all appreciate it and have a voice in shaping it, the more effective it will be. So, one of the things that I think we were surprised, frankly, was that there was considerable consensus that, first of all, what we've done over the last 2 decades has been effective for our disadvantaged students in many ways. By testing and seeing where they are and drawing attention to the fact that they're not all where we need them to be, we've really changed the conversation and drawn attention to the needs in an important way. That work began in Massachusetts. It obviously accelerated a whole lot when the Federal No Child Left Behind Act was passed, and all the states were testing and holding schools accountable for moving all groups of students forward and getting to the same levels of achievement. And I think what's really interesting to see in the data that hasn't really been a topic of conversation, perhaps to the extent as it should have, is the real progress Massachusetts has made over the last decade, when you look at test scores, has been among the low-income subgroups. Our low-income students tested in the middle of the pack in 2003. And when you look at how our low-income students today are testing, they're #1 in the country. And I think by and large that is a tribute to Gateway City educators who have those students. And I think we can't discount the role that accountability has played getting all of our Gateway City educators working hard together to move those students' achievement up. And we see this in the data. When we take all the Gateway City students and we look at how they're testing compared to their peers, their demographically similar peers, which is what you see in this chart, a decade ago there was real gaps. If you were a low-income student in a Gateway City school district, you were performing significantly lower on the MCAS test than if you were in a different district, a more affluent district. Today that's not the case, which is pretty remarkable. We've almost erased all the difference between whether you're in a low-income Gateway City district or a more higher wealth, more resource district. elsewhere, how you're going to test. And again, I think that's a tribute to accountability and the work that Gateway City educators have done to move the dial for our students. In some ways, you would have expected this number to move in the opposite direction, because concentrated disadvantage over the last decade has increased dramatically in our gateway cities, and the work has only become that much harder for our gateway city educators, and yet they are closing these gaps, according to our analysis. All that said, we heard a whole lot about how there's a lot we can do to make our accountability work better. We've learned a tremendous amount over the last 2 decades about what works and what doesn't. Obviously, there's many concerns. I think they're all familiar to folks in this room. We've narrowed the curriculum to tested subjects. If we only focus on the math scores and the English scores, what about the arts? What about the history? How are we preparing people for civic life? Are we giving them the time to actually learn about college pathways and career pathways? Are we giving educators the time to work on social emotional skills? What's happening in after-school programs? Are people, working together creatively, or are they doing more test prep? All those conversations we've heard loudly and clearly. Another conversation that we're hearing increasingly is, what about our most gifted students? Are we paying attention to their growth, or are we most focused on the growth of people who are at the cusp of reaching proficiency? There's real evidence that if you're focused on your data is going to drive you to the students who need the help getting over that bar. And that's where you're really seeing the gains. We're not seeing the gifted students who have great potential being the focus of our attention, getting their equal due. And then the last point, the systems that we have in place, they're not necessarily great for dealing with the complex environments that we have in our urban public schools and figuring out, is that school really doing well in light of all the challenges they face? And that is a really sensitive topic, because we don't want to make excuses. And on the other hand, when you're just looking at statistics, numbers can really be deceiving, and we need to honor the work that is being done. So I just want to spend a few minutes on that point. The research on accountability has grown to kind of a voluminous literature now. So we know a lot about the effects that it's had in a pretty rigorous way. We know, for instance, that it's lowered property values in areas that have schools that have been deemed underperforming. Actually, some of that research has been done by Clark and looks at Worcester neighborhoods. And we know a lot about how parents look at test scores and choose homes based on test scores. And if our indicators of school quality aren't perfect, then they're giving poor signals about neighborhood. In stable neighborhoods, that's the last thing they need. In the same token, if they're not reflecting the work of the teaching team, they're making it difficult for schools to recruit talented teachers. There's evidence that teachers leave schools as their accountability levels fall. And the teachers who leave are the most talented teachers generally. There's a lot of work about improvement culture and data science that shows if you want to use data to drive improvement in an organization, there has to be buy-in about the validity of those data. And I think in a lot of our gateway city schools, educators have embraced the data and have worked with them to drive improvement. But in just as many cases, the teaching teams have said, those data don't honor or reflect our work. We have all these other reasons why they don't look good, and data hasn't been embraced and used in quite the way it could be to lead to better outcomes for students. So that's an issue. And then, lastly, I put on there misspecification of the problem and the solution. I think this is a really important one that we need to reflect on deeply. If we're saying the problem is the schools are terrible, they're low performing, we don't address all the other issues in the community that may be contributing in a much more important way to student outcomes. And I give as an example our work on corrections reform in Massachusetts. We just mapped incarcerations in the city of Boston. And there are neighborhoods in Boston where every other home has an incarceration in just the last few years. And you can't look at a map like that and not wonder how the school in that community is supposed to do its job effectively. And so there's all kinds of other related issues in our healthcare system and in our housing that relate strongly to student outcomes. And if we place the blame on the schools inappropriately, we're not going to direct as many resources and attention to those issues. So, just to kind of a note, as we've seen more focus on accountability, we've seen a steep increase in concentrated poverty, as I mentioned before, in our gateway cities. And that really affects the fiscal health of these communities because, as I said, it reduces their property values. In comparison to major cities like Boston, all of our gateway cities rely heavily on residential property values. 2/3 of their income comes from the residential tax base, not the commercial. So if our school quality figures aren't right, we take away resources from the community to address all these other issues. It's a real problem for us. So how we move forward with gateway city leadership, I think, if we reflect, we made a lot of progress the last decade or two with our accountability policies. We can get even better and make even more progress if we work together on these issues. First and foremost for us is actively capturing the performance of our inclusive urban public schools. We know statistically how to control for factors and really specify what is it that the team of teachers in this school added in terms of the growth and learning for these students. All of our measures should be able to do that in any formula we use to denote school performance. Looking at accountability from a local perspective, we've placed really the onus on the state to decide what performance looks like and what our priorities are and how are we achieving them. The state really can't do all the accountability work for all the different kinds of communities in our Commonwealth. There needs to be a component of local accountability where we say these are our priorities as a community that we're all working toward holding each other mutually accountable for achieving. And let's lay them out on paper, collect the data in a way that's reliable and communicate that with our residents to show we're making progress. And then the last point is really building into our system a way to continuously improve it. It shouldn't be a kind of once every 2-decade exercise to get better at accountability. This is really important work. We continue to learn about what's working and what's not. How do we have more of a feedback loop where educators and people who are really at the front lines have a voice in figuring out what works and helping to improve it. And this is really critical as we think about next generation assessment. In the future, we're going to get much better at picking up on the abilities of students and what they're learning and what they need to continue learning than our current assessments are able to do. And really thinking about how we're innovative in that realm, in engaging the community and the teachers in that is really the next important piece of work before us. So I'm going to hand it over to Matt, but before I do, I just want to show a few slides that are also in your packets that show voter support for these kinds of approaches. I think one way to think about this is in terms of how well our schools are doing preparing people for careers and for citizenship. That's where our residents give them the lowest marks today. Less than half of people think we're doing that work well. And the discrepancy between gateway city voters and folks elsewhere isn't that large. I think everybody universally feels we should be doing better in terms of getting kids ready for the future. But voters don't see enough information to actually know how well schools are doing this kind of work. They're clearly saying we need multiple measures and lots of different indicators of how well our schools are giving kids those learning opportunities, experiences, and how ready they are. And lastly, if you look at a whole set of different questions we asked around this idea of how important it is for the local community to be involved in this work, overwhelmingly, people do see a local responsibility for collecting data, holding schools accountable, innovating. All of that isn't something that the people are looking for the state to do. I think, like it or not, there's less trust in government at higher levels today, and they really see it as incumbent on you as the community to lead the way forward on this. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what we have. All that's in your packets. We're really happy to continue engaging in this conversation. Like I said, it's very complicated stuff, and we're still learning, and really look forward to this dialogue today to hear more about what you think. So Matt, I think we're ready for your slides now.